Hi, my name is Cenzo Townshend and we're at Decoy Studios here in Suffolk, which is my base and has been for about 4 years. I was a recording engineer for many years, working mainly with Ian Brodian and Stephen Street, where we recorded everyone from Blur to Ordinary Boys to Kaiser Chiefs. And then we shared a studio together in Olympic called The Bunker. And that's when I started to specialise in mixing. So I was in Studio 3 in Olympic for about 3 or 4 years, purely mixing. When Olympic unfortunately closed, I moved to Metropolis, where I spent, I think, 2 years before I managed to set up a small room here in this building while we built the main studio. I kind of modelled it on a studio called September Sound that used to belong to the Cocteau Twins in the 80s and was built by Pt.1. And the upstairs room was a big, nice area with glass frontage overlooking the Thames, and that's roughly where this was modelled on. I was adamant that all the rooms in this building would be useful spaces that people wanted to be in. There were compromises made in some areas to make sure that these booths and live spaces were big and airy and comfortable with glass doors and daylight, because I spent literally 20 years without seeing any daylight, so I was quite keen to see some. When I first arrived here, this studio was an empty barn with an office, and I moved in to the office to start with to mix a Maccabees album. I then went on to a couple of other albums while we were building this, and this took pretty much 2 years to complete. Decoy Studios comprises of my mix room, which is an SSL 6000 room, and this control room we're in now, which is an Audient room. The live room is predominantly constructed for drums, so that drums would sound good in there. The library is the vocal booth, if you like, although we have recorded drums in there. It's big enough for a string quartet if we need to. The ID22 we use for the iMac in there, so that we do some prep and some pre and post production. Or if anybody comes in with a laptop and wants to do some work, it's a very quick way for us to integrate their laptop or whatever they're using. It's just one plug and it's done. It's got 2 great microphone amplifiers in it, so we do use it for reamping. We have used it to do piano overdubs when we're busy in here. Somebody wants to do a piano or a guitar, we can work from the library and just use the ID22 for inputs, which works fine and it sounds fantastic. No noise, which is exactly what we need for that kind of work, especially for pianos. We were without it for a little while. Hugo from the Maccabees spent a lot of time in the library, and then when he left, he borrowed one of our ID22s. In fact, I've never seen it again, actually, to be honest. So, mixing-wise here, we've had 4 #1 albums, which have been fantastic. The Maccabees was one #1 we had. We've done 2 Maccabees albums here. George Ezra was #1. Passenger, I think, was a #1 album. Apart from that, we mix a lot of radio singles. Everyone from Christine and the Queens to Soak to Tom Jones, James Blunt and Ed Sheeran, Jake Bugg album. So it's quite an eclectic mixture of music that we work on here. It's either whole albums or radio singles, mainly Radio 1 and Radio 2 mixes. We mix predominantly in a kind of hybrid situation where we use a lot of the automation in the box, but the summing is done on the consoles. We do have a lot of analog equipment, which is something I'm still passionate about using, and I still use as much as I can. Most of the equipment that you will see is patched in and is used daily. I tend to use Pultecs and 1176s on vocals. I have an ear compressor, which is great for vocals and bass. We use a lot of passive equalizers. We use a lot of hardware effects like Eventide H3000s and Bricasti reverbs. Plugins are fantastic, they just do a great job, but there are certain things that I can only get from a hardware, something like the Lavry or the H3000s. I use a mixture of different speakers here. In here we've got my old trusty KRK 9000Bs that are fantastic, quite evil sounding, so one has to be a little bit careful with them. I've got the Amphions, which are a new discovery to me, which I love. The smaller ones in here and I have the larger ones next door. NS10s with which I couldn't work. I could have all the speakers in the world, but I'd have to have a pair of Yamaha NS10s. Just maybe it's because I've always listened to them, but there's something about them that works and translates very well. Using an analog console is something that a lot of clients that I have come here is a luxury that they don't often have. The sonic footprint of a console, for me, if we record a band and the whole band is recorded through the console, or 95% of it, you might want to use an esoteric microphone amplifier for something or whatever, but generally if most of the instruments are going through the console while you're recording it, there's a cohesion that happens. There's something that happens that gives the recording a footprint, an inherent sound already, that is very difficult to achieve with using 3 APIs on the snare drum and 2 SSLs on the overheads and a Neve on the kick drum. It becomes a little disparate for my liking, really, to be honest. I have all these microphone amplifiers. I've got 16 Neves and in fact more. But we found that we don't actually need to use them. We found that the sound of the console is so good, and I really like the glue that happens between the instruments when we use the console in itself, just on its own. For mixing, again, it has a similar effect. It imparts an analog feel, sound to the mix, which is great. And for guys who are learning how to engineer, to do it on a work surface, on a console, is much more intuitive. We can show them how to do things far quicker than on a DAW, to be honest. And also it leaves them with a more in-depth understanding of what exactly is happening and where the signal's going, and why you have to have the gain right on the mic amp before the output, before it goes to a compressor. It's just it's a much more intuitive way of teaching somebody to work.